The fire in the forge slept, a bed of deep orange embers breathing softly in the darkness of the smithy, and the only sounds were the whisper of the bellows and the tiny metallic click of a tool, no bigger than a thumbnail. Silas worked by the light of a single oil lamp that threw his shadow long and stooped against the stone wall, a patient giant tending to a delicate heart. He was not shoeing a horse or hammering a plowshare into submission, for that was louder, coarser work for the daylight hours when the town needed its beasts and its fields attended to. This was different. This was night work, the kind that required a stillness the day could never afford, a quiet focus that banished the heat and the dust and the memory of the sun that beat down on the parched land outside. In his calloused fingers, held with a gentleness that defied their rough texture, was the brass cylinder of a music box, its fine comb of metal teeth rusted and bent. One of the teeth, a high, clear note that had once been the peak of a simple melody, was broken clean off. The woman who had brought it to him, her face a mask of weary hope, had said it was the only thing her mother had left her, and the silence where that note should have been was a hollow space in her memory she could no longer bear. So, he worked. He did not work for the meager coin she had offered, which he knew she could not spare, but for the challenge of it, for the quiet satisfaction of making a broken thing whole again. He had fashioned a new tooth from a sliver of tempered steel, filing it down with painstaking precision, measuring it against its neighbors until it was a perfect, gleaming sliver of potential sound. Now came the part that required more than skill. It required a kind of faith. With a pair of fine-nosed pliers in one hand and a tiny weighted pin in the other, he prepared to set the new tooth into the comb, a procedure so delicate that a tremor of the hand or a cough from the chest could ruin hours of labor. He held his breath, the world shrinking to the few inches of space between his eyes and his hands, the lamplight pooling on the polished brass. The metal was cool against his skin. The silence of the night pressed in, a physical weight. He lowered the steel tooth into the gap, a perfect fit, and with a single practiced tap of the pin, a sound no louder than a falling seed, it was set. He waited a moment, letting his breath out in a slow, controlled stream, before picking up the small, winding key. He turned it twice, the gears catching with a soft whir, and lifted the cylinder to his ear. The melody began, a fragile, tinkling tune that spoke of parlors and lace, and a world far removed from this dusty, sun-leached place. It climbed its little scale, note by perfect note, and then it came, the new note, clear and bright and true, a tiny star of sound shining in the vast, quiet dark. It was right. He set the box down on his workbench, the melody playing itself out to its gentle conclusion. A small, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth, unseen by anyone. He had mended the silence. That was enough. Morning. The sun burned the haze from the sky and baked the dirt of the street into a fine, pale powder that rose with every footstep and every turn of a wagon wheel. Silas's world was one of routine, a series of quiet, deliberate actions that gave shape to the long days. He rose before the sun, drew water from the well, and stoked the forge until the coals glowed with a fierce, white heat. His movements were economical, honed by years of solitude and labor, each one serving a purpose. There was no wasted motion in him. He spent the morning sharpening a farmer's scythe, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel, a steady, rasping song that was as much a part of the town's morning chorus as the crowing of roosters or the distant lowing of cattle. He worked with his back to the road, a silent figure absorbed in his craft, feeling the town wake up behind him through the vibrations in the ground and the shifting sounds on the air. People passed, their voices muted by the space between his forge and the main thoroughfare, but no one stopped to call out a greeting. They needed his skill, but they did not need him. He was a fixture, a part of the landscape like the gnarled oak that grew by the creek, useful and ever-present, and therefore invisible. He was the town's mender, the one they came to when things fell apart, a broken axle, a snapped harness buckle, a child's toy. They brought him their fragments, and he returned them whole, and the transaction was always the same. A few words about the object, a nod about the price, and then they would be gone, leaving him once more to the company of his fire and his tools. He preferred it that way. The silence was a comfortable weight, a familiar cloak. After he finished the scythe, its edge now a razor-thin line of silver, he wiped his hands on an oily rag and went inside his small attached cabin. The space was sparse and clean, a testament to a life lived without excess. A narrow bed, a simple table and chair, a shelf with a few worn books. He took the mended music box, wrapped it carefully in a piece of clean linen, and walked into the heart of the town. The heat was a solid thing now, pressing down from a brassy sky. He kept his eyes on the ground, his stride long and even. At the Mercantile, a place that always smelled of coffee beans and smoked meat in the dry, papery scent of ledgers, he handed the wrapped box to the storekeeper's wife. She unwrapped it, her expression doubtful, and he watched her wind the key. The melody played, clear and whole. A flicker of surprise, then pleasure, crossed her face. "It sounds just like it did," she said, her voice softer than he was used to hearing from anyone. He simply nodded. She paid him, the coins cool and heavy in his palm, and he turned to leave without another word. He bought a sack of flour and a side of bacon, necessities for the week ahead, and started the walk back to the quiet solitude of his forge. The town was a place he moved through, not a place he belonged to. He had long ago made his peace with that. He was halfway home when he saw her, a figure shimmering in the heat haze at the edge of town, where the road dissolved into the endless, sun-scorched plains. She was just a shape at first, dark against the bleached landscape, a smudge of movement where nothing ought to be moving in the dead heat of the afternoon. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a woman, walking with a stumbling, determined gait, as if she were counting each step and forcing her body to take the next one through sheer will alone. She carried a small, dusty bundle tied with twine, and she kept her head down, her face hidden by a worn bonnet and the shadows of her own exhaustion. She did not look like she was arriving from somewhere. She looked like she was escaping from it. Silas stopped, his own sack of flour suddenly feeling heavier on his shoulder. He was not a man who invited complication, and this woman was a walking, breathing complication. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way she moved as if pursued by ghosts. He watched as she finally reached the first building of the town, the livery, and leaned against its wall for a long moment, her chest heaving. Then she pushed herself upright and continued on, her eyes scanning the storefronts, the closed doors, the shuttered windows. She was looking for something, or someone. He saw her approach a group of men lounging in the sliver of shade offered by the Mercantile's porch awning. He saw her speak, though he was too far to hear the words. He saw the way they looked her up and down, their gazes lingering, and then the way one of them laughed and made a gesture of dismissal with his hand. She flinched, a small tight movement, and turned away, continuing her slow, painful progress down the street. She stopped at the saloon, then at the boarding house, and each time the encounter was the same. A few words, a shake of the head, a door closed quietly in her face. The town was shutting her out, its collective back turned against this unwelcome intrusion of need. Finally, her journey brought her to him, standing there in the middle of the road like a silent sentinel. She stopped a few feet away, her breathing ragged. She lifted her head, and for the first time he saw her face. It was young, but etched with a weariness that belonged to someone much older. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were shadowed with desperation, but held a flicker of something else, something stubborn and unbroken. "Water," she rasped, her voice dry as dust. "Please." He said nothing, simply shifted the sack on his shoulder and jerked his head toward his forge. He led her back to his well, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy. He worked the pump, the handle groaning in protest, until cool, clear water gushed into the stone basin. She fell to her knees and drank from her cupped hands, again and again, the water running down her chin and soaking the front of her grimy dress. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. It was then that he truly saw them. Her hands. They were raw and chapped, the knuckles split and bleeding in places. Old white scars crisscrossed the backs of them, and the palms were thick with calluses so deep they looked like hardened leather. They were the hands of someone who had known nothing but ceaseless, punishing labor. They were the hands of a person treated like a tool. "Thank you," she said, her voice a little stronger now. She got to her feet, her gaze falling on the forge, the neat stacks of iron, the rows of finished tools. "Is there work?" He looked from her face to her hands and back again. He was a solitary man. His life was a closed circle, and he had no desire to open it. It was safer this way. "No," he said, his voice curt. "No work here." She did not argue. She did not plead. She simply gave a small, tired nod, as if she had expected this answer all along. She picked up her bundle, which she had set on the ground, but she did not leave. Instead, she walked to the sparse shade cast by the wall of his workshop and sat down, drawing her knees up to her chest. She closed her eyes, and she waited. The sun bled across the sky and sank below the horizon, pulling a blanket of cool purple shadow over the land. The cicadas began their nightly thrumming, a sound so constant it was like a second silence. Silas worked, hammering a set of hinges into shape, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal a familiar comfort. Every so often he would glance over at the woman. She had not moved. She sat as still as a stone, a small, huddled shape in the growing darkness, as if she had decided that this patch of dirt was the end of the line and she would go no further. He ate his supper, a hunk of bread and a piece of the bacon he had bought, cooked over the dying embers of the forge. The smell of it, rich and salty, drifted on the air. He could feel her watching him, though she made no sound, no move to approach. He finished his meal, wiped his hands on his trousers, and stood for a long moment, caught in a state of indecision he rarely felt. His life was built on clear lines and solid rules, and the most important rule was to mind his own business. The world was full of trouble, and the surest way to avoid it was to never invite it in. This woman was trouble. He could feel it radiating from her like heat from sun-baked stone, but he could also see the raw, bleeding cracks on her knuckles, and he could not shake the image of her hands from his mind. He let out a long, slow sigh that was part of the language of his solitude. He went inside his cabin and came back with a tin plate holding another piece of bread and bacon and a dipper of water. He walked over to her and set it on the ground beside her, saying nothing. He turned and walked away before she could speak. He did not want her thanks. He did not want to know her name or her story. He just wanted to be left alone. But when he woke the next morning to the first pale light of dawn, she was still there. She was sweeping the dusty yard in front of his workshop with a makeshift broom she had fashioned from a fallen branch and some twine. The plate and dipper he had given her were washed and neatly stacked by his door. He stood in the doorway, watching her. She worked with a slow, methodical rhythm, her movements efficient, her focus absolute. She was not trying to impress him. She was simply working because it was what she knew how to do. It was all she had. He watched her for a full minute, his arms crossed over his chest. This was a complication that was not going away. "There's firewood that needs stacking," he said, his voice rough in the morning air. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise. She stopped sweeping. "Round back," he added, and then turned and went to his forge, his duty as a reluctant host done. He did not check on her. He did not speak to her again. But when he went to the woodpile that afternoon, he found it stacked in a perfect, tight rectangle, sorted by thickness, more orderly than he had ever bothered to make it himself. Days later, she was still there. She had a name now, Alara. She had offered it one evening, her voice quiet and hesitant, as she handed him a bowl of stew she had made from a few vegetables she had managed to coax from a neglected patch of dirt behind his cabin. He had simply nodded in response, but he had taken the bowl and eaten every last bite. A strange, unspoken routine began to form between them. She would do the tasks he did not have the time or inclination for, mending his worn shirts with neat, tiny stitches, tending to the small garden, keeping the cabin swept and free of the ever-present dust. In return, he provided her with food and the silent, grudging protection of his space. They rarely spoke. Their communication was a thing of gestures and actions. He would leave a worn-out tool on the workbench, and the next morning he would find its wooden handle sanded smooth and oiled. She would leave a patch of his torn leather apron by his plate, and he would return it to her the next day, stitched and stronger than before. She was a quiet, unobtrusive presence, and he found to his surprise that his solitude felt no less complete with her in it. It was merely different. One afternoon, a horseman reined in his mount in front of the forge, kicking up a cloud of dust. It was Fletcher. A man whose wealth had been built on the debts and misfortunes of others, who owned the mercantile, the saloon, and the mortgage on half the farms in the county. He was a man who smiled with his mouth, but never with his eyes, and his presence always felt like a cold draft. He dismounted, his expensive leather boots making no sound in the thick dust. His gaze swept over the workshop, dismissive and proprietary, before it landed on Alara, who was scrubbing a pot near the well. He looked her up and down, a slow, appraising glance that was an insult in itself. "Silas," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant, though he did not look at the smith, "didn't take you for a man who collected strays." Silas stopped his work, the hammer in his hand feeling unnaturally heavy. He turned slowly, his face impassive. He said nothing. Fletcher smiled, a thin, unpleasant curve of his lips. He walked closer to Alara, who had frozen, her hands still in the water. "Some things aren't worth fixing, Smith," Fletcher said, his eyes still on her. "They break again, or they run off, owing a debt they can't pay." His words were aimed at Silas, but the threat in them was meant for her. Alara visibly shrank, pulling her hands from the water and hiding them in the folds of her apron. Fletcher chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He turned his gaze to Silas at last. Just a friendly piece of advice. He mounted his horse, gave one last, lingering look at Alara, and rode away, leaving a tense, vibrating silence in his wake. Silas watched him go, his knuckles white where he gripped the hammer. He looked over at Alara. She was still standing by the well, her head bowed, looking smaller than he had ever seen her. He did not know her story, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that Fletcher was a part of it. The closed circle of his life had been breached. Trouble had not just been invited in, it had been given a name and a face. The encounter with Fletcher left a stain on the quiet rhythm of their days. A watchfulness entered Alara's eyes, and she started at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, her body tensing until the rider had passed. Silas found himself watching the road more often too, his hand resting on the heavy hammer at his side. The unspoken truce between them deepened into a silent alliance. He began to teach her small things, not with words, but by demonstration. He showed her how to properly temper a small blade, letting her work the bellows, her face glowing in the heat of the forge, her expression one of intense concentration. He showed her how to read the grain of wood, how to know which piece would split and which would hold, and soon she was carving new handles for his files and rasps, her scarred hands surprisingly deft and steady. She learned quickly, her mind as sharp as any tool in his workshop. She had a gift for seeing the weakness in a thing, the point where it was most likely to break, and an instinct for how to make it strong again. She was a mender, like him. One evening, as they sat outside watching the stars emerge in the ink-black sky, she spoke of her past for the first time. Her voice was a low monotone, devoid of self-pity, as she told a story of indenture, of a debt her father had incurred, and that she had been forced to work off on a farm 2 counties over. It was a story of endless work, of little food, and of a master whose cruelty was as casual and constant as the rising of the sun. She had finished her term, her debt paid in full with 7 years of her life, but the man had claimed she owed him more, for food and board, for a dress that had torn. He had produced a new contract, his signature already on it, and told her she would be signing it in the morning, so she had run. She had run in the dead of night with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small bundle she carried, walking for days, sleeping in ditches, heading for a place where no one knew her name. She did not cry as she spoke. Her hands lay still in her lap, the starlight catching the silvery lines of her old scars. When she finished, a heavy silence fell between them. He did not offer words of comfort or sympathy. The story was too hard for soft words. Instead, he reached over to the small fire they had built and added another piece of wood, the flames leaping up, pushing back the darkness a little further. It was a simple gesture, but it was all he had to give. A week later, Fletcher returned. He did not stop at the road this time. He rode his horse directly into the yard and dismounted as if he owned the place, his boots crunching on the gravel. He carried a coiled whip in his hand, tapping it idly against his leg. Silas was at the anvil, and he did not stop his work, the ringing of the hammer a steady, defiant beat against Fletcher's intrusion. Alara was by the cabin door, mending a sack, and she went very still, the needle frozen in her hand. "I've come with an offer," Fletcher said, directing his words to Alara, pointedly ignoring Silas. "A proper one. My wife needs help in the kitchen. A scullery maid. You'd have a roof over your head. 3 meals a day. Better than sleeping in a shed and eating a blacksmith's scraps." The offer was an insult, a reduction of her to the lowest possible station, but it was phrased as an act of charity, a trap she was meant to be grateful for. Silas's hammer blows slowed, each one landing with more force, a punctuation of his rising anger. "It's honest work," Fletcher continued, his smile never reaching his cold eyes, "and it would put you under my protection. A woman alone needs that." Alara looked from Fletcher's smug face to Silas's broad, tense back. She saw the coiled whip in Fletcher's hand. She saw the rigid line of Silas's jaw. She took a slow breath, her first real act of defiance. "I have work here," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear and firm, and it cut through the rhythmic clang of the hammer. The hammering stopped. The sudden silence was immense. Fletcher's smile tightened into a bloodless line. He finally turned to Silas. "You do well to remember the laws about harboring vagrants, Smith. This town has an order to it. People who disrupt that order, they find things stop going their way. Credit dries up, wagons break down, and no one's in a hurry to fix them." The threat was unmistakable, a promise of isolation and ruin. Silas turned from the anvil, his face slick with sweat and soot, his eyes dark and unreadable. He looked at Fletcher, at the whip in his hand, at the arrogance in his posture. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a silent mountain of a man, and his stillness was more intimidating than any shout. Fletcher held his gaze for a long moment, then let out a short, sharp laugh. "Have it your way," he said, swinging himself back onto his horse. "But when she runs out on you, don't come crying to me." He wheeled the horse around and galloped away, leaving the dust to settle in his wake. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. He just gave her a short, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned back to his anvil. The hammering began again, steady and strong. It was the sound of a line being drawn in the dirt. The days that followed were taut with a new kind of tension, the quiet before a storm. The town seemed to be holding its breath. When Silas went to the mercantile for supplies, Fletcher served him with a cold, precise politeness that was more menacing than open hostility. Other townsfolk, who had once offered a grudging nod, now looked away, unwilling to be associated with him. He was being quietly excised from the community, his isolation now enforced by a silent, collective shunning. He did not seem to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign. His routine did not change. He rose, he worked, he ate, he slept. But there was a new alertness in him, a readiness. He kept the great forge hammer, the one he used for shaping axles, close at hand, leaning against the wall just inside the workshop door. Alara, too, felt the change. The women who came to the well in the morning would fall silent when she approached, turning their backs to her, their buckets suddenly needing their full attention. She was an outsider marked by two sins. She was a stranger with a questionable past, and she had refused the charity of the town's most powerful man. She had aligned herself with the smith, another outcast, and now she shared his exile. But the isolation, instead of breaking her, seemed to temper her resolve. She worked with a fierce, quiet pride, her chin held a little higher. The garden flourished under her care, producing a surprising bounty of beans and squash. She learned to set snares, and occasionally they had rabbit for their stew. She was a survivor, and she was making this small patch of ground her own, inch by hard-won inch. She and Silas spoke even less than before, but their silence was now a shared language of mutual understanding. He would watch her hands as she worked, no longer seeing just the scars of her past, but the strength and capability they now represented. She would watch him at the forge, seeing not just a blacksmith, but a man who could create and mend, a man whose stillness was a shield. One evening, she found him at his workbench, staring at the delicate, broken arm of a porcelain doll. "The miller's girl," he said, without looking up, "fell off their wagon." He poked at the fractured pieces with a thick finger, his expression frustrated. The tools he had were too coarse for such a fragile thing. The next morning, he found a small pot of a thick, sticky paste on his bench. Alara was by the stove, grinding down fish bones into a fine powder. "My mother used to mend pottery with it," she explained. "It dries clear and strong." He looked at the paste, then at her. He tried it. With her guidance, he meticulously pieced the doll's arm back together, her smaller, nimbler fingers helping to hold the tiny fragments in place. When they were done, the break was almost invisible. They had mended it together. The fragile victory felt more significant than it should have. It was a small act of creation in a world that seemed bent on breaking things. It was a brief and fragile peace, and they both knew it could not last. A week later, as dusk settled over the valley, they came. Fletcher was not alone this time. He had two men with him, hired hands from his ranch, broad-shouldered men with dull, indifferent eyes, who followed his orders without question. They had been drinking. Silas could smell the sour scent of whiskey on the air from 50 feet away. They stopped at the edge of the yard, their horses shifting nervously. "Evening, Smith," Fletcher called out, his voice thick with false cheer. "I've come to collect my property." He held up a piece of paper. "This is a writ of indenture for a runaway named Alara, signed by her rightful master in the next county. It seems he sold her contract to me." It was a lie. Silas knew it, and Alara, standing frozen in the doorway of the cabin, knew it too. But the paper looked official enough, and in a town where Fletcher's word was law, it was as good as the truth. "She's a thief," Fletcher continued, his voice growing louder, playing to an unseen audience of listening ears behind shuttered windows. "Stole food and clothing. I'm just here to see justice is done." One of his men dismounted, a length of rope in his hand. He started walking toward the cabin, toward Alara. Silas moved. He did not run. He simply placed himself between the hired man and the cabin door, his body a solid, immovable obstacle. He did not pick up the hammer. He did not raise his fists. He just stood there, his feet planted in the dirt, his arms hanging loose at his sides. He was the anvil, refusing to yield. Fletcher laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Get out of the way, old man. This has nothing to do with you. The hired man paused, looking to his boss for instruction. Silas did not look at Fletcher. He looked at Alara, who stood in the shadows of the doorway, her face a pale oval of fear. But behind the fear, he saw the same stubborn, unbroken light he had seen the day she arrived. Her resilience called to his own. He would not let this happen. He would not let the world break this one small, good thing. He took a slow, deliberate step back, closing the distance between himself and the doorway. He reached behind him, not for a weapon, but for her. He found her hand in the darkness and drew it forward. He held it up in the fading light, his rough, soot-stained fingers wrapped around her scarred ones. He held it gently, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. She belongs here, he said. The words were quiet, a simple statement of fact. They were not a threat or a challenge. They were the truth. And in the vast, tense silence of the evening, they landed with the force of a hammer blow. The hired man stopped dead, his eyes darting from Silas's calm, unyielding face to the hand he held, then back to Fletcher. He was paid to be muscle, not to navigate the strange, powerful currents of a man making a stand on a principle he didn't understand. Fletcher's face, which had been alight with smug triumph, contorted into a mask of disbelief, then rage. The smith's quiet defiance was an insult he could not tolerate. It was a public challenge to his authority, a rejection of the fear he used to control everyone and everything around him. He spurred his horse forward, stopping just feet from Silas. I have the law on my side, you old fool, he snarled, waving the paper. That girl is mine. Now move. Silas did not move. He did not even flinch. He just stood there, holding Alara's hand, his gaze locked on Fletcher, his stillness a palpable force. He had mended broken things his whole life, but this was different. This was not about fixing an object, but about defending a person. He had spent a lifetime in solitude, believing it was his nature, but in this moment, he understood that he was not just standing for her. He was standing for himself, for the quiet, orderly world he had built, a world that had no place for bullies and liars. Fletcher, maddened by this silent refusal, dismounted and strode toward him. I said, move, he shouted, and shoved Silas hard in the chest. It was like pushing against a stone wall. Silas barely shifted, his feet rooted to the earth. He simply absorbed the impact, his expression unchanging. Fletcher's rage, deprived of a satisfying reaction, curdled into something uglier. He raised his hand to strike, and then a sound broke the standoff. A door creaked open at the house across the way. The miller, a man who owed Fletcher a great deal of money, stood silhouetted in his doorway, watching. Then, another door opened, and another. Windows were unlatched. Faces appeared in the twilight, pale and curious. The townspeople, drawn by the shouting, were bearing witness. They did not come to help. They did not speak a word. They simply watched. Fletcher's world was built on transactions that happened in the quiet of his office, or through the subtle pressure of veiled threats. He was a creature of shadow and influence. This raw, public confrontation with the whole town as an audience was not his territory. He stood there, his hand raised, and suddenly he looked not powerful, but foolish. His cruelty, stripped of its quiet authority, was just ugly theatrics. He saw the judgment in the eyes of his debtors, the contempt in the faces of men he thought he owned. In their silence, he was being weighed and found wanting. The stillness had defeated him. Silas had not fought him with fists, but with a quiet, immovable dignity. And in front of everyone, Fletcher had been proven the weaker man. He let his hand fall. He spat on the ground near Silas's feet, a petty, final gesture of defiance. Have the stray then, he muttered, his voice low and venomous. She'll bring you nothing but trouble. You'll see. He turned, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and climbed back onto his horse. Let's go, he snapped at his men, who seemed relieved to have an order to follow. They mounted up and rode away, not in a gallop, but in a slow, ignominious retreat. The sound of their hoofbeats faded into the night. The doors and windows of the town closed one by one, the silent audience melting back into the shadows. The street was empty again. It was over. Silas stood for a long moment, the silence of the yard settling around him. He could feel the fine tremor in Alara's hand, the aftermath of her fear. He slowly, gently let it go. He turned to look at her. In the deep twilight, he could not read her expression, but he felt the weight of her gaze on him. Neither of them spoke. There were no words for what had just passed between them. He had drawn a line around her, around them both, and the world had, for now, agreed to respect it. He turned and walked back to his forge, the place where he made sense of the world, and began to bank the fire for the night. The simple, familiar task was an anchor in the sudden, dizzying shift of his life. He was no longer just a mender of things. He was a protector, and he was no longer alone. The seasons turned. The punishing heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The dust settled, and the air grew sharp with the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The world changed, and so did the small space around the smithy. Fletcher was a rarer sight in town, and when he was seen, he carried himself with a brittle, defensive anger. His power had been tested and found hollow, and the knowledge of it had diminished him. The townsfolk, while still distant, began to treat Silas with a new, grudging respect. They would meet his eye now, offer a stiff nod. They had seen him stand when no one else would, and while they had not stood with him, they had witnessed it. And it had changed their perception of the quiet man at the edge of town. The change between Silas and Alara was quieter, but more profound. The space between them, once filled with the tension of unspoken questions and shared danger, was now filled with a comfortable, working silence. They moved around each other with an easy, practiced grace, a partnership forged not in words, but in shared labor and mutual reliance. He had taught her to work the forge, her arms growing strong from pumping the bellows and swinging the lighter hammers. She had a feel for the metal, a patient hand, and she took over the mending of smaller household items, freeing him for the heavier work. In return, she taught him the rhythms of the earth, showing him how to read the clouds for rain, how to bank soil against the coming frost. Their home, once just his shelter, became theirs. She planted late-season flowers in pots by the door, bright splashes of color against the gray stone. He built a sturdy new fence to protect her garden from foraging deer. They were building a life, not with grand plans or declarations, but with small, steady acts of care. One afternoon, they were repairing a section of the roof before the winter rains came, working side by side under a pale, watery sun. He was nailing down new shingles, and she was handing them up to him, her movements quick and sure. He paused, watching her hands as she selected the next shingle. The scars were still there, a pale webwork across her skin, a permanent map of her past. But the hands themselves were different now. They were no longer the raw, damaged things he had first seen. They were strong, capable, confident. They were the hands of a woman who knew her own worth. He remembered the feel of her hand in his that evening, the fine bones and the surprising strength, the way she had held on, not in fear, but in solidarity. He had held her hand to protect her, but in doing so, he had anchored himself. After a lifetime of solitude, he had found his place in the world standing next to her. When the last shingle was in place, they climbed down from the roof. She stood before him, a smudge of tar on her cheek, her hair coming loose from its braid. He reached out, not to wipe away the smudge, but to take her hand. He turned it over in his own, his thumb tracing the lines on her palm, the calluses from the hammer, a mirror of his own. He thought of all the work those hands had done, the pain they had endured, the things they had created and mended. They told the story of her survival, of her resilience, of the quiet dignity she had never lost. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to the scarred knuckles. It was not a gesture of romance, but of reverence. It was a wordless acknowledgement of everything she was, everything she had overcome. It was a thank you. It was a promise. She looked up at him, her pale blue eyes clear and steady, and for the first time since he had known her, a true, unguarded smile reached her eyes, crinkling the corners and illuminating her whole face. The sun was setting, and in the warm golden light, he saw that the broken, stray thing he had been warned against had turned out to be the one thing that had finally made him whole. You see, the world is full of people who are judged by their scars, by the rough texture of their hands, by the weariness in their eyes. We are taught to value what is new and pristine, to look for perfection, to turn away from anything that looks too worn, too used, too broken. We measure worth in currency and status, in the smoothness of a person's path, and we forget that the truest strength is often forged in the hardest fires. The most profound beauty is not in the absence of flaws, but in the grace with which they are carried. But every now and then, you meet someone who knows how to look deeper, someone who understands that a callus is a testament to resilience, that a scar is a story of survival. They are the menders, the quiet ones who don't seek applause or recognition. They see the value in what others have discarded. They know that a thing is not defined by how it was broken, but by the fact that it endured. They reach out a hand, not in pity, but in respect. And in that simple, profound act of seeing another person's worth, they remind us of our own. Perhaps you know someone like that, someone whose quiet strength has been a shield for you. Or perhaps you have been that person for someone else. The world can be a loud and brutal place, quick to judge and slow to kindness. But the choice to see the dignity in another human being, to honor the history written on their skin, is an act of quiet rebellion. It is the most powerful way we have of mending our broken world, one small, decent gesture at a time. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story meant something to you, we hope you'll consider sharing it, and perhaps join us again for another. Until then, be well and look for the beauty in the things that have endured.